So the idea of Underdark Rising basically is we take the concept of the Underdark as this functioning society. There's a a spectrum of races and species in the Underdark that have societies like dark elves and not drow, those are dark elves, but the deep gnomes and the Dwergar. Thank you. Yeah. Along with a lot of demons and other types of creatures that only exist in the Underdark reside. Our premise, or my working premise at the time, was what happens if the Underdark effectively invades the surface world, and what would that look like? And that seemed like an interesting world-ending kind of cataclysmic event to kind of just in general explore. It was intellectually interesting to me, like what happens, because that not dichotomy, but the separation between the Underdark and the normal regular world in Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of other RPG settings that have similar concepts is always pretty strict. There isn't a whole lot of overplay. You are either in the Underdark or you're not. You don't really interact with races from the Underdark except maybe the Drow if you're on the surface, and even then extremely rarely. So you kind of had this underground world that like you're saying, you don't usually engage with unless things have gone horribly wrong in a normal fantasy style setting. And what you wanted to do was you wanted to really ram that society straight into the surface world and conduct the thought experiment of what does that mean? Yeah, exactly. And since I wanted, the races of the Underdark to basically have their way with the surface world, that necessitated coming up with a reason for them to be able to exist on the surface world that made sense, that made thematic sense. And so Underdark Rising basically evolved into this concept where there was a cataclysmic event in the world that basically shrouded out the sun below a certain altitude. And once that happened, all of the races of the Underdark poured out of the Underdark and kicked the crap out of the surface world. And so when you are in the campaign setting itself, you are, several hundred to about 1,000 years after this event, and the world is still basically shrouded in darkness. And the only places that see sunlight are the tops of really high mountain ranges, and they tend to be individualized peaks. And around these peaks, different forms of, the descendants of these various surface world societies have congregated at these locations, and they're kind of like the last bastions of the surface world that still remain, and they are in fact called the Bastion Cities. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and and the motivation that I really liked about this when you pitched me the idea originally was that, from a macro perspective of how these different cultures operated, the flow made a lot of sense to me. Right now, I am versed in the overwhelming majority of the R.A. Salvatore writings for the Drow and Drizzt and Menzoberranzan and all of these, and
far more than I am.
Yeah, well, and so this was where it was, you kind of stoked that fire a little bit with this idea, because one of the characteristics that at the very least, I have always internalized as how the Underdark species, the Underdark populations stay in check, is that they are, by all accounts, superior war-making cultures than the surface dwellers, right? Anytime that you're featuring in a regular fantasy game dark elves or dark dwarves that do show up on the surface, they show up and they are terrifying raiding forces that descend upon villages, they slaughter, burn, and capture, and then before the sun comes back up, they throw their plunder into their wheeling carts, and they drag that crap back to the Underdark space, right? And whole villages, whole towns would just vanish, overnight. They would smolder and vanish overnight. And so, you had these legitimately superior species that were hanging out down there and that were so practiced at making war against each other because it's a finite space, and were so practiced at attacking the surface world that if they were going to be unleashed, there were going to be a real problem for the surface dwellers. And the thing that I liked about this was, the characteristic of them that has always kept them in check of why don't they just hit the surface world and run, is because every day the sun comes up. And that inherently limits their ability to get out and to be as effective as they normally are, when it's dark and whatever. And so, you've got this really strong kind of voracious appetite, this unhinged ambition from these races that, when you insert cataclysmic event that kicks up this dust cloud or whatever into the sky and, suddenly makes the sun no longer a thing, it's open season for these battle tried and tested, hardened, they're coming up, and they're coming up to get you, and suddenly they're not kept in their little box, someone left the gate open and they're running train.
Right, and there's a lot of advantages that they possess, especially in an environment that is equivalently night for all intents and purposes, because